Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In our first 5 episodes, we've spoken about the most important Christian teachers in the generation after the Apostles. You've heard names like Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, and next episode you'll hear about Hermas. Those are important names to remember because they represent important characters not only in the story of their generation, but in the grand story of Christianity. Yet they're not the whole story. In fact, some of the most important texts of that generation have come down to us nameless. They're anonymous, or they carry a pen name, a pseudonym, but their true author is probably unknown. Or they claim corporate authorship, representing not an individual, but a group. Today we're going to take a look at a sampling of those texts. We honor them because our ancestors did. The early church took care to preserve these texts in a time when it was extremely expensive and extremely dangerous to do so. Documents had to be copied out by hand, by skilled labor, and the possession of any one of these books was evidence enough to get a man or woman convicted of a capital crime. Our ancestors honored these documents by keeping them and using them. The fathers of later generations quoted them often. The works we'll look at today were cited by at least some of the fathers as if they were scripture. We possess all these documents, in fact, because they were bound up in the same volumes with ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. They were kept right there with the canonical Gospels and epistles. We're looking at 3 books today: the Didache, the Letter of Barnabas, and Second Clement. There are other anonymous and pseudonymous texts from the time of the Apostolic Fathers, but I plan to consider those in the weeks to come when we devote episodes to biblical apocrypha and to the first movement in apologetics. Today let's start with the Didache. Aside from the books of the New Testament, the Didache may be the only text we have that has been revered by every single generation of Christians, including the first. Didache is the Greek word for teaching, and the book's full title is Teaching of the Lord Through the 12 Apostles to the Gentiles. So you can see that the document claims some mighty authority for itself. The Didache is a complete instruction manual for setting up and running a Christian congregation. It's the earliest example of a type of book that historians call church orders. It's like a missal and a prayer book and a book of counsel all wrapped up in one. It includes a summary of Christian doctrine to get new converts started. It tells you how to baptize properly, and it gives some instructions for daily prayer. It has a liturgy for the Eucharist and a prayer to be said after communion. It tells you how to deal with traveling clergy and teachers and how to staff a local church. And it concludes with a brief explanation of what Christians can expect in the end times. Scholars disagree among themselves about the origins of the Didache, but a growing number agree that its ritual portions are very old. The great historian of liturgy, Enrico Mazza, holds that those passages were probably written down no later than 48 AD. The eminent U.S. historian of the Apostolic Fathers, Clayton Jefford, also accepts Mazza's early dating of these sections. If these men are right, then at least parts of the Didache are older than most of the books we find in the New Testament. Thus, the Didache gives us a vivid picture of the early church as it looked when the apostles were still alive. And the most surprising thing about it is that there are no surprises. It shows us a church we instantly recognize. We see our own liturgy, our own doctrine, our own church organization. They're all in a more primitive state, but already the elements we recognize are there. It looks like the Catholic Church to us. But to someone who lived in that first century, the Catholic Church would have looked remarkably Jewish. Much of the material either comes from Jewish sources directly or is inspired by Jewish practice. Christians in that generation weren't thinking of themselves as practitioners of a new religion. They thought of themselves as true descendants of Abraham and Moses and the prophets, but descendants who were living under new conditions. The Messiah had come, and the world had changed. The Didache starts with a summary of Christian doctrine, introduced with a sermon on the two ways there are, one of life and one of death, and great is the difference between the two ways. This sermon would probably have been familiar to any Jewish listener. There's a similar two ways discourse in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. In the Didache, the two ways section leads into some of Jesus' teachings that we remember from the Sermon on the Mount. But nothing in those teachings would have struck a Jewish hearer as the least bit unorthodox. The Christians would seem to be a Jewish group repeating the teachings of their favorite rabbi. When we come to the Eucharist, we recognize something very much like our modern Christian liturgy. But scholars identify the Eucharistic prayers as variations of familiar Jewish mealtime prayers. Thus, the most distinctively Christian ritual, the Eucharist, is accompanied by prayers that are instantly recognizable as Jewish. So it makes sense that the Eucharistic prayers are Jewish. These are the prayers we've always prayed, fulfilled. The Didache, says one modern scholar, presents a church still in close proximity to Judaism and still developing its distinctive traditions. The Didache prescribes a prayer to be said over the cup of wine and a prayer to be said over the broken bread. It mandates a closed communion, offered only to the baptized believers. And even the baptized are encouraged to approach only if they have confessed their sins. The Eucharist is to be celebrated every week on Sunday, the Lord's Day. Here, at the very beginning of Christianity, it's already assumed that Sunday Mass is the ritual heart of the Church. It's asserted, moreover, that the Eucharist is a sacrifice. It's called the sacrifice. In fact, according to the Didache, the Mass is the fulfillment of the prophet Malachi's prediction of the time of the Messiah. Quote, "For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations, and in every place incense is offered to my name, and a pure offering." That's Malachi 1:11. The Mass is that perfect sacrifice, offered now among the Gentiles as well as the Jews. The Didache probably found its final form around the year 100 AD. It was quoted often by the Church Fathers, and later church orders incorporated sections of it verbatim. But the text itself, in its first century integrity, vanished from the historical record. Then in 1873, a clergyman named Philotheos Bryennios discovered a copy in a monastery's archive in Constantinople. Shortly afterward, a partial manuscript was uncovered in Latin, enabling scholars to compare and corroborate the texts. The recovery of the Didache in 1873 certainly ranks among the most important finds for the field of early church history. But let's move on now, from the Didache to the so-called Letter of Barnabas. In a future episode, we'll look at more texts like this one, texts outside the Bible that claim authorship by a biblical figure. But Barnabas is among the earliest, and it was very influential, so I thought it best to treat it today. The Epistle of Barnabas is traditionally attributed to St. Paul's traveling companion Barnabas, but it most likely was not written by him. It was probably the work of some unknown Christian writer between the year 80 and the year 100. In style and substance, it is much like the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. It uses Jewish techniques of biblical interpretation to demonstrate that Jesus is prefigured throughout the Old Testament. The author seems to be deeply familiar with Jewish apologetical, philosophical, and moral works. Like the Didache, the letter to Barnabas includes a section outlining the two ways one can live, the way of life and the way of death. And it's worth mentioning that both the Didache and Barnabas oppose the same immoral practices, including procured abortion. It is likely that the author of the Letter of Barnabas was a Jew, writing to other Jews. He draws liberally from the oracles of Isaiah and applies them to the life of Jesus. He invokes other prophets and the books of the Torah as well. In fact, he finds the earliest foreshadowings of Jesus in the book of Genesis, in the story of creation. Many scholars believe that the letter of Barnabas was written in the city of Alexandria in Egypt because the author employs the allegorical technique that was favored by both Jews and Christians in that city. He reads the Old Testament story of the scapegoat, for example, as an allegory of the life of Jesus. The book of Leviticus prescribes that once a year the sins of Israel must be placed onto a goat that is then driven into the desert. And the letter of Barnabas asks, "Is not this he whom we once despised and pierced and mocked and crucified?" Similarly, the letter sees Jesus prefigured in the red heifer of the book of Numbers. The unblemished heifer is slaughtered and burned outside the camp, just as Jesus was executed and buried beyond the city gates of Jerusalem. And there are Old Testament correspondences for the cross of Christ, the sacrament of baptism, the church, and so on. The author notes also that the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed, but was now replaced. With the indwelling of Christ, every Christian's heart had become a temple. The arguments in the letter of Barnabas will be familiar to anyone who's read the New Testament epistles. But the rhetoric is harsher. The debate is now more urgent, the differences drawn more sharply. The stakes seem higher now that the temple had been destroyed by the Romans. The Jews were in rebellion against Rome, and the Christians chose to take no part in that rebellion. Jesus had predicted that his followers would be expelled from synagogues, and that prediction had come to pass in the ministry of St. Paul. He was tossed out of the synagogue in Pisidian Antioch, and in Corinth he had to set up for teaching in the house next door to the synagogue. Now, in the time of the letter to Barnabas, the gulf was widening. Thus began the process that modern historians describe as the parting of the ways, the emergence of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism as two separate phenomena, two different world religions. The polemical pattern started quite early, and the letter of Barnabas gives abundant evidence of this. It was a family dispute, and those are the fiercest because they are most passionate. Like every story of family estrangement, the story of the parting of the ways is heartbreaking. We'll have occasions to come back to it several times in the coming years. But for now, we'll move on from Pseudo-Barnabas and turn to Pseudo-Clement. If we count Clement as the companion of St. Paul mentioned in Philippians 4, then the document known as Second Clement should fall into the same category as the letter of Barnabas. It is a letter pseudonymously attributed to a character we meet in the New Testament. But it's actually a very different kind of text. It's different in tone, in style, in audience, and in many other ways. In fact, Second Clement is probably not a letter at all, but it may be the oldest Christian sermon that has survived to reach our generation. And it's beautiful, gentle, winsome, and rich. Its opening line affirms the divinity of Jesus Christ, making the text an important witness in the history of dogma. Quote, "Brethren, it is fitting that you should think of Jesus Christ as of God, as the judge of the living and the dead." Unquote. Second Clement was set down probably around 100 AD. It is a long meditation on salvation, repentance, and faith that is manifest in good works. As in the New Testament, salvation is presented in terms of illumination and the gift of divine filiation. Through baptism, believers have become divinized so that they can truly be called children of God. It was almost certainly written to be read aloud to a congregation. The author urges his listeners to give heed to his words, not only as they sit before him, but also once they have gone home. The preacher is a Christian, of course, and his text is aimed at fellow Christians. Indeed, it seems that both the speaker and his listeners were Christians of Gentile origin, having converted from Greco-Roman idolatry. He says, quote, "We were deficient in understanding, worshipping stones and wood and gold and silver and brass, the works of men's hands, and our whole life was nothing else than death. Involved in blindness and with such darkness before our eyes, we have received sight." Unquote. So again, this is a document quite different from the letter to Barnabas. Addressed by a Gentile Christian to Gentile Christians, its persuasion is passionate, but never adversarial. There are several curiosities about Second Clement. Jesus is quoted often, and that shouldn't surprise us. He's quoted 9 times, in fact. But only 5 of those passages are from the Gospels we know from the New Testament. The other 4 logia must be drawn from oral tradition, non-canonical Gospels, or some other saying sources from the first generation. There's nothing scandalous or controversial about these apocryphal sayings. They're a lot like other sayings in the Gospels, but they do suggest that Second Clement was set to paper at a very early date, when there was some diversity of opinion about the authoritative sources. So how did this letter come to be attributed to Pope St. Clement of Rome? That's a question that has fascinated scholars, and there are many hypotheses about the origins and purposes of Second Clement. I think the text was attributed to Clement because it was usually bound into books along with the authentic letter of St. Clement to the Corinthians, the letter that's usually called First Clement. And I think it was bound into books with First Clement because it was the sermon preached in Corinth immediately after Pope Clement had resolved that church's disputes. Second Clement is a peacemaking, back-to-basics homily, helping all sides of the argument remember why they were gathered together in the first place. And so we bring to a close our discussion of anonymous, pseudonymous, and group texts from the time of the Apostolic Fathers. There are other texts that fall into this category, but we'll discuss those in future episodes. We may not know who set pen to paper to write these books. We may not know whose names should appear in the bylines. But the works belong to the ages. They belong to the church. They belong to us. And they merit further study. If you want to read more about these and other texts of the early church, I invite you to go online and visit CatholicBooksDirect.com. Catholic Books Direct is offering a significant discount available only to listeners of this podcast. If you go to CatholicBooksDirect.com and place an order, use the coupon code FATHERS, and you'll get 10% off your order. Just to repeat, if you go to CatholicBooksDirect.com and place an order, use the coupon code FATHERS, and you'll get 10% off your entire order. And most of the books at Catholic Books Direct are already deeply discounted. Catholic Books Direct is a family-owned business. So, tolle lege, take up your books and read, and come back for the next episode of The Way of the Fathers.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.